Good evening, everyone. My name is Vicki Goodman, and on behalf of UCLA's Friends of the Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's presentation on the teenage brain. Now, some of us who have raised teenagers and lived with them might sometimes wonder, is there a teenage brain there? And we're very excited to hear from Dr. Daniel Siegel about the power and purpose of the teenage brain. We're very honored to have Dr. Siegel with us this evening. This is the second time that he has spoken for an open mind presentation. The first was in 2010 when his book was Mindsight was published. And we very warm welcome and a huge thank you for taking the time once again to speak to our audience and educate us this time about teenagers. So thank you, Dr. Siegel. Dr. Andrew Luchter, who is our faculty advisor and a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral sciences at the David Geffen School of Medicine here at UCLA and a past chair of the Academic Senate, will be introducing his colleague, Dr. Siegel, who is a professor of clinical psychiatry at the School of Medicine and also the director of the Mindsight Institute. He will introduce him in just a moment. I first need to tell you about some of the exciting programs that the Friends have coming up. Tonight's program is the last in our spring 2014 season. We will resume again in October with a presentation of the award-winning documentary film Hidden Pictures by Dr. Delaney Rustin. And this is a film about the state of mental health all around the globe. It's a fascinating film, and I hope you'll all join us for that presentation. In November, we will have a presentation on ADHD by Dr. Stephen Hinshaw from UCSF. The book is The ADHD Explosion, and we think that this is a topic that is going to be of great interest to a lot of people, and hope that you will register just as soon as we send out the invitations. In February, we are very excited to be presenting a program on autism with Pulitzer Prize winner Ron Suskind. His book, Life Imagined, is the story of his son who is autistic and who learned to communicate with his family by watching Disney animated films. And just program, not even on our website yet, in March, we will have a program on child and adolescent mood disorders with Dr. David Miklovich, who is the director of the Child and Mood Disorder Program at the Semel Institute. All of these programs are always listed on our website, friendsofthesemelinstitute.org. Please be sure to visit us. You will also find on our website information about our Friends Scholar Program. This is a program that we support. We award grants to brilliant young scientists who are doing state-of-the-art research to unlock the secrets of the mind and brain and to develop new and improved treatments for mental and neurological disorders. We have several of our Friends Scholars here in the audience this evening, and I'd like to invite them to stand so you can see who they are. We have Dr. Mirio Cho, who is doing research on concussions suffered from sports injuries. Dr. Cho, there she is. Dr. Tara Parrott, who is working with children with OCD. Dr. Felipe Jain, who is using his knowledge of Eastern meditation skills and his training as a psychiatrist to work with caregivers who have loved ones with Alzheimer's to help ease their depression. And Dr. Erin Kelly, who is working with the underserved and homeless population to help improve their access to both medical and physical care. So we're very, very proud of our young scholars. And I'm very proud to announce that our Friends Gala, which is now entitled the Great Minds Gala, will be on April 19th at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel. This is our fundraising event, and all the proceeds go to support our Friends Scholar Program. The Great Minds Gala will be honoring UCLA Chancellor Gene Block and Congressman Patrick Kennedy. So I hope that some of you will come out and support us so we can continue to support the research of such brilliant young scholars who are working to help us all. So without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Luchter, who will introduce Dr. Siegel. Thank you so much.
Well, good evening, and many thanks to you all for coming out this evening. Many thanks to the Friends for organizing what has been just a tremendous year of open mind events. I know many of you have been here for a whole series of these, and it's great to have a full house to wrap up the season with. I know that many of you are going to have questions that you're going to want to pose to Dr. Siegel after his talk. We will have people circulating with question cards during the talk and immediately afterwards. So please, if you'd like a question card, just flag somebody down, fill one out, and we'll do our best to get your questions answered this evening. It really is a pleasure and an honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dan Siegel. I was speaking with Dan ahead of time, and he was telling me just how much interest this topic of the teenage brain generates, mostly because everybody's had experience trying to deal with the teenage brain. How many of you have raised teenagers? Okay. You know that there are many different types of teenagers. Some of you have those teenagers who are meticulous, well-organized, punctual, always on top of every detail. And then there are those of you who raise boys. I say that with great affection as the father of 3 boys. This is really, a fascinating topic. The phases of development are not purely psychological, they're also quite physiological. They have to do with when different areas of the brain get connected, get wired up, become mature, come online, as it will. I made the mistake of teaching one of my boys about neuroscience, only to have him say to me one day, "Well, Dad, you shouldn't expect any better. My frontal lobes aren't mature yet." And Dr. Siegel's book really pulls all this together. He draws heavily from neurobiology, from psychology, from mindfulness and human development, really to give us a comprehensive view of what it is like going through adolescence, both from the psychological and from the physiologic perspective. Dan is one of the most highly sought after teachers on our faculty. He's a former director of our Child and Adolescent Training Program at the Semel Institute, is a clinical professor of psychiatry, is, as Vicki said, the director of the MindSight Institute, is the editor of a best-selling series of books on interpersonal psychology and neurobiology that is published by the Norton Press. Brainstorm itself was on the New York Times bestseller list, not only as a general book, but also as one of the top science books when it came out just a few months ago. And it is truly my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you Dr. Dan Siegel.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you. Good evening. Can you hear me all right? No, I have to turn this on. Good evening. Good evening. How about that? Great. Thank you. Thanks, Andy, for that lovely introduction, and I want to thank all the people at the Friends of the Semel Institute for inviting me to, again, join you for the Open Mind series. It's an honor for me to be here with you to talk not only about the adolescent brain, but actually to talk about, in general, where we are in the field of mental health within our culture. So I'll try to weave that together in some of the things we touch on. I was an adolescent, basically, when I first stepped to the grounds at UCLA. I had dropped out of medical school for a while, and I came knocking on the door of a fellow named Jolly West, who was the chairman of the department, and Jolly took me into his office, and we had a long, long talk about what might be available here. And so I went back and finished my schooling, a lot inspired by what Jolly said, and after starting in pediatrics, switched over to join our department. So it's truly a coming home for me. And in many ways, today, this morning, my 24-year-old came home from after being away for 14 months, so I haven't seen him. So it was very sweet to have him coming home. And just 2 days ago, I saw our 20-year-old daughter on her academic organic farm where she has found her deep passion recently. And so we'll talk about that. So I bring up my kids because part of the reason this Brainstorm book came to be written was because as our kids, my wife's and my kids were leaving their own teenage years, we felt like we had a whiplash. And we said, what in the world happened there? And so I got very inspired to try to look at the information that was available. And as Professor Luchter mentioned, I've been busy working in a field called interpersonal neurobiology, which is where we basically take all the different disciplines of science, from math and physics to chemistry and biology to psychology and sociology and anthropology and everything in between, and we combine them into one framework. So that field, interpersonal neurobiology, now we have these 36 textbooks that I've overseen the publication of them, and it's in mental health that it's applied, in education, and in parenting. And so everything I'm going to say comes from the perspective of interpersonal neurobiology. So it's a little different from saying it's just a talk on psychology or just a talk on neuroscience, because we actually do what E.O. Wilson would call find the consilient overlaps. Consilience meaning if you looked at independent disciplines, say neuroscience and anthropology, and found common universal principles, could you actually create a whole framework based on that consilient approach? So that's a field called interpersonal neurobiology. That's where we're going to come from. So we're going to look at three elements as we look into adolescence to figure out what this period can be understood as being comprised of. And we're going to look at three elements. Those elements are, number one, we're going to look at something called the mind, which for an open mind talk is probably a good place to start. Then we're going to look at something called the brain, and even ask the question, are they the same thing? Is the mind and the brain just really talking about the same thing? And in fact, in 1992, when I was the director of training in child and adolescent psychiatry, I brought 40 scientists together, mostly from the UCLA campus, to ask that one question. What is the connection between the mind and the brain? And so we'll be touching on that a little bit. And the third element we're going to talk about is something that you probably hold near and dear to your life, but it's usually not put up on the same level as mind and brain, but I think it needs to be, and that's relationships. So when I was in training in my clinical work to become an adult psychiatrist and then a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I got a research grant from the National Institute of Mental Health to actually study how relationships shape the mind of the child in a field called attachment. And that was in 1989, and it was just as I was in the middle of that fellowship that 1990 happened, which what you may recall was the beginning of the decade of the brain. And so I became a nuisance to all my teachers because I kept on saying, what's happening in the brain in a relationship between a parent and a child that helps a mind develop with resilience? and what happens in the brain of a child when the relationship is not supporting the development of resilience. Does that make sense? And so for me, those questions became very, very important. And just to give you a teeny bit of the personal side of this, when my young son, who's now 24, was with me, we were playing with these stones near this apartment where we lived. The streets were very crowded one day in what usually is a pretty quiet neighborhood. And that night after I put him in bed, I got a phone call. That was one of the most painful phone calls I ever got, which was that one of my favorite professors, in fact, a mentor of mine here at UCLA, was killed by a 19-year-old driving almost 100 miles an hour on a surface street. And that moment was so painful, not just for the loss of this unbelievable human being, professor, but also to know that some poor adolescent had made the decision to drive that fast and not only ended someone's life, which was terrible, of course, for my professor and was terrible for our field and terrible for his family, but it was terrible for this 19-year-old. It's terrible, bad, bad, bad. And I said to myself, looking at my son in the crib, was there something I could do as his father so that as my wife and I raised him, there'd be something that we could be doing relationally that would get his brain to develop so that the brain and the relationships were combining to allow his mind to be the mind of a 19-year-old who would not do that. And that became a question that was deep, deep inside of me. Was there anything we could do as parents? And of course, we all know, since many of us in the room raise adolescents, there's only so much you can do as a parent. But the fact is, we now know, and there was a suspicion of it back in then, which is 1990 we're talking about, that what you did with your mind actually could change the structure of the brain. It was a notion, it was an idea, it got turned down whenever I tried to publish it, but now it turns out to be true, that what you do with your mind, which we're going to define in a moment, can actually change the structure of your brain. And it turns out also to be true that what you do with your relationships changes not just the function of what's happening in the brain in the moment, but actually the structure. So back in 1990, it was just a kind of a wondering and, a kind of a puzzlement and trying to put the pieces of that puzzle together. But now we know from science all sorts of amazingly fantastic things that hardworking empirical scientists have demonstrated that get published in some of our world's most revered scientific peer-reviewed journals that we can then use in a practical way as clinicians, we can use it as teachers, we can use it as parents, which is what I'll focus on today. So to really dive into this material, to really look at how do relationships shape the unfolding of a brain, to allow, for example, an adolescent to make it through these years without driving that fast and injuring someone, we need to look at some of the fundamental ways that the brain functions. And I really want to thank Dr. Luchter and the whole Friends of the Semel Institute, because what they've done is they've come in ahead of time to this room, and under your chair, they have taped a model of the brain that you're able to take home with you. So if you reach your hand under your chair and feel deep in there, and then pull your arm out, you'll find attached to your arm is a hand. And this is your handout for tonight. And this hand model of the brain, and my daughter says, "Dad, don't ever say it's a handy model of the brain," so I didn't say that. But the handy model of the brain goes like this. You fold your thumb in the middle, because we're going to be going through neuroanatomy tonight, and put your fingers over the top. This is a pretty accurate model, actually, of the brain that would sit in your head like this. So throughout this whole evening, we will be referring to your model of the brain, and you do get to take it home with you. Please don't forget it. And it's very useful because when you teach this to yourself, you can actually understand your own experiences. And when you teach this to an adolescent, they actually, as I've gotten emails from adolescents themselves, because Brainstorm is written for adolescents, and adults can read it too, but it's written for adolescents, that they can actually use knowledge of the brain to focus their mind and their relationships in ways that can promote a stronger brain, if you want to just start with that term. We'll get more specific than that. So knowing about the brain is not only interesting if you're kind of an academic nerd like I am, but if you're interested in practical applications, it's useful to know about the brain, because what you do with that knowledge can make all the difference. So we're going to be referring to this over and over again. So the first place to begin with is that back when Dr. Luchter was in training, or when I was in training, or let's go even further back, when I was in training in pediatrics, what we used to say about adolescents is exactly the same thing that you hear parents learn from those pediatricians who were trained when I was in pediatrics. And you also hear it from the media, you hear it from teachers, and even if you talk to adolescents, because I've been given the privilege of teaching to middle schools and high schools since the book came out, and when I ask adolescents themselves, what's this period about? They pretty much are the same across all those groups. And what do people say is the main thing that's happening in adolescence? You tell me.
Hormones.
Exactly. And what are those hormones doing? Raging, exactly. They're raging hormones. So the first myth we're going to bust right now, and we're going to bust a few of them, is the idea that adolescence is a time of raging hormones. This is true not just in the United States. I get to teach in different countries. It's true in every country I've ever been to. Raging hormones is the main story you're told. Now, the problem with the raging hormone story is a couple things. Number one, it's wrong, so that's not so good. Number two, it makes you, if you're an adolescent or an adult caring for an adolescent, totally helpless. If I tell you you've got raging hormones streaming through your bloodstream, you tell me, what are you going to do about it? Like go get your blood filtered and have the ones with anger management problems go get a little therapy? What are you going to do with your raging hormones? You're just going to act out. So not only is there nothing you can do, but you'll make an excuse about it. So it's a disempowering lie. Now it is true. What's the truth? The truth is hormones rise at puberty. With the development of ovaries and testicles, you do get more sexual hormones that are rising, not raging. These rising hormones do affect the brain, for sure. But the good news, once we go to the brain, as we've said a few moments ago, is that you can use your mind to change what your brain is doing. I don't know of anyone who knows how to use the mind to change, I don't even know what a raging hormone would be, but the ragingness of a hormone. So that's the first myth. What's another myth that you hear about adolescence? You wouldn't even know it's a myth. But what else do you hear about adolescents? Well, they're moody. They are. It's true. Emotions are more intense during adolescence. And so part of that intensity we'll talk about. So that's actually a true statement.
Risky behavior.
What's that? Risky behavior. And that's a true statement. In fact, between the ages of 12 and 24, the chance of having a serious lifelong injury or even death by a preventable causes, injury or death from preventable causes, is 3 times as likely, even though in adolescence, which we're going to define in a moment, but let's say the second dozen years of life, even though your body is stronger during this time than any other time, so if you're going to get an infection, for example, best to get it during your adolescence, you have a strong body, but you're 3 times more likely to have a serious thing because of risky behavior. The myth embedded in that is that all risky behavior, the risky part is true. And that's what I tell kids, the adolescents in the schools. I say, your parents are worried about risk, they're not making it up. This is the stat on that. So you need to understand why, so you're not that kid behind the wheel of going 95 miles an hour on a surface street. And they go, ooh, like that, because I tell them that story. I said, and the only one who's going to have you not press down on that pedal is you. So let's talk about it, right? So people say, and this is the myth, that the risky behavior is only due to impulsivity. Now, impulsivity is present in the early years of the teenage time, right? So 12, 13, 14, there's no question. the statement that Dr. Luke just said about a prefrontal cortex, it isn't able to inhibit a lot of the impulses, so it's true. But risky behavior goes on even after impulsivity goes away. So we're going to actually explore what that's about. Another myth, besides the notion of impulsivity and raging hormones, is that adolescence is a horrible period of life that if you're lucky, you get through it alive with as few battle scars as possible, and what you should do is get through it as fast as possible. So if you talk to parents of kids who are like 8 or 9, 10, and you say, well, adolescence is coming up, they start to shake, which is another reason why I wrote this book, not only for adolescents, but for parents, so they could understand what was going on. So the myth that adolescence is a horrible period we have to just get through, let's just say this. You're going to learn some things in the next half hour that I'll just ask you, after you hear them, do you think it's a time to just get over? Okay. So let's go through, and we're going to do a couple of layered things with our hand model of the brain. We're going to keep an eye on those three entities, relationships, mind, and brain. We're going to define each of them right now. Then we're going to go through neuroanatomy and neurodevelopment so we can see what happens during, let's say, the first quarter of a century of your life in your brain. So we'll do that. Then we'll talk about what is the essence of adolescence, what are its core features, what are its downsides, and how can we minimize them, and what are its upsides, and what we can do about them. Now you can see why this can sometimes be an 8-hour talk, right? Because we're going to try to touch on all that in this short amount of time. But let's give it a go. So here we go. The first thing, mind, brain, and relationships. The reason to start here is because if you're going to understand from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view this issue about how to approach adolescence, we have to make sure our terms are defined. So what I'm about to say to you is not commonly held as definitions. So I want you to be careful that if tomorrow night you go to a party and you're with a bunch of other people trained in science, you may say what you heard and they may roll their eyes and say, that's ridiculous. Because I've actually given lectures here at UCLA. I once gave a lecture to all the retired professors of UCLA. They asked me to come give a lecture. And in the back was one of the professors who was not retired. And in the middle of the talk, he got up and started screaming at me, yelling at me. And so the head of the retired professors group had to ask him to please be quiet. And he wouldn't. So then a number of them got up, and they're pretty strong retired professors, and I guess he took his spot down. But when I was done, he came up to me and wouldn't stop talking to me, so he walked me to my car because I had a patient to see. He was so angry, and what he was angry about was what we're going to talk about right now, which is what I'm going to suggest to you is that the brain, as part of the whole body, is super exciting, super important. It's fabulous to know about, but it's not the same as the mind. Oh, this just pissed him off. And he even said to me when I had to go see my patient, he said, I'll bet you're going to use this, me yelling at you as an example in one of your talks. I said, yeah, I will. I don't know his name, but I wouldn't use his name anyway. I'd respect his privacy, even though he's not my patient. So the issue is, why is it commonly said, he's not alone, because, I would say the vast, vast majority of people in science these days are saying the following thing: the mind is what the brain does. How many of you believe that? Wow. Okay, that's amazing. 5 people in a room with 400 people. That's really incredible. So in science, I would say, from my impression, it's generally reversed, at least in neuroscience for sure. So I want to respect the view that the mind is what the brain does and suggest that there's a lot of power to that perspective, but it's not the whole picture. It's part of a picture that's a very important part. Now, why am I bringing this up? Because if you believe the mind is what the brain does, then one of the conclusions that I've been told from the scientists who believe that is that the brain determines the show, and that you're kind of helpless to do anything about it. So what you should do with adolescents, for example, is just keep them busy, or give them some good homework to do, or something like this. Keep their brains busy, rather than engaging their minds to get what we now know is true, which is that the mind, which we'll define in a moment, can actually get the brain to do something that doesn't naturally do. So David Miklovitz was mentioned earlier as the head of the mood disorders for child and adolescent psychiatry. David is doing a beautiful and really important study with individuals with manic depressive illness, teaching them to use their mind to change the functioning of their brain so that they can use mindfulness meditation to strengthen the capacity to regulate mood. Now that doesn't prove if that study turns out to work. It's a double-blind controlled study. Even if that works, it doesn't mean the mind isn't just what the brain does, but it's an interesting notion that at least liberates us to say, are these really the same? So in this group back in 1992, the definition that I offered them, because no one had a definition of the mind, and I'll just say this to you that's really weird to say, but I'll just say it. I've asked 100,000 mental health professionals in rooms like this all around the planet. I've asked 18,500 K through 12 teachers the same question. Number one, have you ever been given the definition of the mind? And way over 95%, it's really more like 98%, say never. And the next question, of course, is, have you ever been said what a healthy mind is? And it's the same percentage. Now, I'm a mental health professional, I'm a clinician, I'm an educator. I find this is a very important thing to realize. So part of why my kids always say, why are you going around teaching so much? Because in 1992, the definition of the mind that I had to offer this group so it wouldn't just explode with tension was a definition that turns out to have powerful predictive ability to predict what future scientific studies would ultimately show, which it did. And so this becomes a very useful, at least starting place. It's not saying this is the final definition, but it's very useful. And for an adolescent, when you understand this definition, it actually empowers you rather than making you helpless. So the definition of the mind that I gave this group was basically, this is not a science talk, it's an adolescent brain talk, so I'm just going to give you the punchline of the joke. But the issue is that the mind can be defined, one aspect of the mind, as a self-organizing, emergent process. Those are mathematical terms from complex systems. That's parenthetic, but a self-organizing, emergent process, which is, and here's the key issue, it's both embodied and relational. So it's not just up in your skull, it's throughout the whole body, and it's not even just constrained by your skin, it's actually between you and other people, and even between you and the planet. That's what I mean by relational, the connection of your inner self with the other things in the world. So it's a self-organizing, emergent, embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. Regulates the flow of energy and information. Flow is change across time. Energy is the potential to do stuff. Certain patterns of energy, like if I say, that would be energy, right? Air molecules moving, that's kinetic energy of air molecules. But there wasn't any information to it. There are features and textures to it. You could measure it, but there's no information. Information is defined as a pattern of energy that has symbolic value, like if I say Golden Gate Bridge, right? But do any of you speak Greek? Sort of. If I say glikanara. Glikanara. Don't say it. Yeah, don't say it. So no one else speaks Greek. Now, it's a great place if you are 25 and want to live on a nudist beach in Crete. So now you know what glikanara means. It means sweet water. It's a sweet water beach. But before that, it just was sound waves. So energy is the basic movement of this potential across time, and that's the flow. And what regulates it, what we're going to propose, is the mind. Now, the good thing about defining the mind as a regulatory, self-organizing process is that you can teach someone, as I do in the book, to monitor and to modify that which you are regulating. So you can strengthen the mind literally by stabilizing the ability of an individual to monitor energy and information flow within and between, And then you can actually take this definition, and if you want to know the science behind this, just read the book The Developing Mind, the second edition especially, where you'll see all this spelled out, or the Pocket Guide to Interpersonal Neurobiology. Once you define it as a self-organizing process, you actually can define what a healthy mind is. And I'll just give you the punchline to that too. This is obviously a long line of reasoning. We have a 96-hour training program where you learn all this stuff, but I'll just give it to you in 1 minute. There's a process called integration. Integration is defined as the linkage of differentiated parts. So you have separate things like, let's take relationships, for example. You have a parent and a child. When the parent honors the differences between the child and herself, but then links with compassionate communication, that would be called an integrated relationship. Integration of the brain, for example, might be where the left and right sides are differentiated and linked, or the higher cortical areas are differentiated from the limbic areas and the brainstem areas. So that would be vertical integration, for example, and you can look at 9 domains of integration. Here's the amazing thing. When a system is integrated, it's the most flexible and adaptive. It's coherent, it's energized, it's stable. That spells the word FACES, fortunately. Flexible, adaptive, coherent, energized, stable. It's harmony, basically. Integration is the root of harmony. But when a system is not integrated, it moves to one of 2 poles, or 2 banks of a river, if you want to think of a river. The central part of integration of the river is harmony. One bank outside of integration is chaos. The other side is rigidity. And amazingly, when I had these 15 interns working with me to revise the developing mind, I said, do this little exercise, which I did back in the 90s. Look at the DSM, and you'll find every symptom of every syndrome can be categorized as chaos, rigidity, or both. And then so far in the individuals with the different disorders that have been, their brains have been studied, each one reveals impaired integration in the brain. So for example, individuals with schizophrenia, impaired integration in the brain, if you look at the work of Marcus Rakel. People with manic depressive illness, if you look at the work of Hillary Bloomberg at Yale, impaired integration in the brain. If you look in autism, again, Rakel's study, you see impaired integration. So those are just examples of experientially independent ones, that is, are not caused by what parents do. Sadly, in situations where parents are the source of dysfunction, severe neglect, severe abuse. What does Marty Teicher at Harvard University show? Impaired integration in the brain. So whether it's caused experientially or caused by something else, viruses, infections, random things, genes, either way, you get impaired integration. And what's fascinating, for example, about David Miklovitz's view of mindfulness in manic depressive illness is you can draw on mindfulness meditation as a way to use your mind to integrate your brain. And so even though manic depressive illness isn't caused by experience, you can use mental experience even to try to change structural challenges to integration in the brain. So it's an incredible moment to actually have a fundamental statement that a strong mind is a mind that integrates the brain and integrates relationships. That's a healthy, strong mind. Now, what blew my mind was when our kids were getting through their teenage years, what I decided to do when I was looking at what was available for parents to read, it was all just this confusing set of information. Raging hormones, get over this terrible period, or there's one book that says your teen is crazy. I mean, how insulting is that, right? So I decided to look at what the science is. Now, you may not know this, but in the last 15 years of science, much of it coming from UCLA with Elizabeth Sewell's work, with Mirella DiPreto's work, and also with Jay Geed at the National Institute of Health. What we now know, at least from US adolescents, is that there are huge changes in the brain that nobody predicted would happen. And if you look at these brain researchers and say, what's the ultimate thing this brain is trying to do as it goes through these changes? This blew my mind. You know what they say? The brain is becoming more differentiated and linked so that the goal of adolescent brain changes is integration. And I went, oh my gosh, because then it fit beautifully in an independent way, another example of consilience, with an interpersonal neurobiology framework. So then I reviewed all the brain research that's been done in the last 15 years. It's not that much, so it's not that tremendous a task, but you can do it. So we could actually have a summary of it. And what blew my mind again was that there were 4 fundamental changes that happened that we're going to now review as an essence of these brain changes. So let's come back to our hand model now, knowing that the brain is one incredibly important and fascinating part of the body, but to really understand the mind, which we've defined, we need to understand this collection of neurons in the head, which is ultimately connected to the whole body. It's got about 100 billion basic cells called neurons. There are trillions and trillions of supportive cells called glial cells. This set of neurons is connected in a spider web-like fashion, and this parallel distributed processing system interacts with other organs in the body, like the heart, the intestines, the muscles. And all this system then is embodied. So even if we're going to talk about the brain in our hand, which we're going to do, we need to understand it's always embodied. So if you want to remember that, you can call it the embodied brain. But my daughter says that's redundant. I said, why is it redundant? She was a teenager when she said it. She said, Dad, have you ever seen a brain not in a body? So she's right, but just to remind us, we're not just interested in the skull. It's just the main thing we can study when we put the person in that donut scanner. But we're really talking about the whole body. Now, we didn't define a relationship, so let's do that before we get into this brain. What is a relationship? And if I tell you that if you look at studies of medical health, mental health, happiness, and how long you live, longevity, the number one feature in all 4 of those types of studies is supportive relationships. So believe me, relationships are crucial for your everything. Well, we've defined the mind as a process that's regulating energy and information flow that's embodied and relational. The mechanism of that flow we're calling the brain, if you will, the embodied mechanism of energy and information flow. Basically, the brain is an electrochemical energy transformation machine. It does a whole bunch of incredibly important things. Its details are important. It changes with the experience in a process called neuroplasticity. But what's a relationship? A relationship is the sharing of energy and information flow. So we have relationships of the sharing or exchange. The brain is the embodied mechanism, and the mind is the embodied and relational self-organizing process. Now, you have to look into complexity theory to understand why we're saying that. Bless you. In fact, let's have a bless you for everyone who's going to sneeze. Good, so feel free to sneeze. So, what do we know then? Relationships are the sharing of that flow. And we're saying then, as we get into the brain, that the mind is not just inside your head. It's at least fully embodied, but it's not just even in your body. It's inside of you, and it's between you and others and the planet even. So that's what's different from what you'll hear straight line, at least neuroscientists say. So you have to be very careful tomorrow night at the party that you don't get yourself in trouble just saying, well, this is what the mind is. It's not like it's agreed upon or anything like that. So what I'm suggesting to you is a very helpful frame. Okay. So let's go to our brain and let's say what happens to this thing. Very briefly, the sperm and egg get together, and amazingly, the division of cells of this conceptus will get so intricate that they'll at one point be inner cells and the glob will have outer cells. I say this because the cells that are going to become your neurons begin as the outer layer of this glob, the ectoderm. And basically, it invaginates inward, so that every neuron used to be a skin cell, basically. Your skin is all about the interface of the inner and the outer. Neurons are just the same. It's just important to know that. They're always about the inner and the outer interface. Now, as the brain develops, it's driven by genes. Genes are unbelievably important, the sequence of DNA. And now we know it's not only the sequence of DNA, but it's the non-DNA molecules that sit on top of the DNA called epigenetic molecules, molecules like histones and methyl groups that are going to actually change the configuration of the genes to alter how a gene is basically going to impact development in something called gene expression. So all you need to know about that is you have genes and you have epigenetic factors, both of which you inherit. The really new thing we're learning is experience that you're having right now can affect your epigenetic regulatory molecules that you, if you're in the prime time of developing your sperm and egg, if you were a young boy or if you were in utero right now as a female, you could actually alter the epigenetic molecules that you pass on to your offspring based on your experience, like if you're in a famine or in the Holocaust. So these are really crucial things just to keep in mind. So genetics and epigenetics, really, really, really important. So when the baby is forming in utero, you have all these things that have nothing to do with the direct mental experience of the mother or the father, but they've been passed through these important molecular issues. The baby's now born. Now we come out actually pretty immature. We're very dependent creatures. And what that means is that the organization of the brain, let's take out our hand model. We're going to look at what McLean calls a triune model, just because it's a good teaching model to use. So this would be oriented like this. The spinal cord, which is that invaginated neural tube, is here in your wrist. All the stuff from the body is going to come through the spinal cord and also through something called the 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, up into the brain itself. And there are three major parts to what's going on in the skull. If you lift up your higher finger part and lift up your thumb part, let's look at the first part, the brainstem. The brainstem is sometimes called the old reptilian brain because it's 300 million years old. It houses areas that regulate the body, like your heart, your respiration, your digestion. And it also houses aspects of the system that are the fight, flight, freeze, and faint response. So that's the old reptilian brain. It's pretty much well developed when you're born, but it continues to affect you throughout your whole life, including adolescence. Okay, now if you put your thumb over, we'd have two thumbs to be a perfect model, left and right. So now the brain is differentiated left and right. The limbic area has 5 functions. We'll just mention them briefly. Each of them change in adolescence. So to really understand the changes in adolescence, we need to understand how this limbic area is what it's called, the old mammalian brain, is changing. So the first thing to say before we get into the details is that overall what's happening in this brain, which shocked everyone, is 2 things that fall under one title. The one title is called remodeling. So in the first dozen years of life, the way to think about it is the child is accumulating more and more connections among these neurons as the child interacts with parents, peers, and teachers and soaks in knowledge like a sponge. That's all beautiful. That's the way the child is going to develop our human culture, through learning. Learning is based on developing neural connections. Fantastic. You would imagine that that would just continue, but it doesn't continue like that. It continues in a different kind of way. The first way that kind of shocked everyone is the brain, as a part of this remodeling process that people didn't know about before 15 years ago, the brain starts to whittle itself down in a process called pruning. Pruning seems to be genetically determined. It seems to have its somewhat of a relationship to puberty, but not necessarily. And what's happening in the pruning is that you're beginning to specialize regions of the brain. So a child's brain uses a huge amount of metabolic energy to solve problems because things are going everywhere. But as an adolescent matures, especially by around 15, 16 years of age, they're actually incredibly efficient problem solvers, especially if their friends are not around. Seriously. It's called cold cognition, where the friends aren't heating things up. This is a very powerful thing to understand. They're specializing their brains, that's the differentiation part, and it is a use it or lose it principle. This is what I say to kids when I'm asked to go to the middle schools and high schools. I say, look, it's not up to your parents or your teachers, it's up to you. You want to keep a circuit where you can speak a foreign language, play a musical instrument, you want to have an athletic thing that you do well, then you do it because you want to do it. Because your brain is going to let that go. Because it's watching really closely for what you do. And if you're doing a lot of this, which is a mouse movement with a game, on a video game, you're going to have a really big part of your brain that's devoted to that. And that's just up to you. Right? Your brain responds to what you do with your mind. Your mind, if you're talking about regulating energy and information flow, what is that? That's attention. Attention is that process which streams energy and information flow. So I say to these kids, what you decide to do, you, is going to determine the use it or lose it aspect of the pruning. So that's the first part of remodeling is the big thing. The first aspect of the two is pruning. The second thing that happens is something called myelinization. Myelin, M-Y-E-L-I-N, myelin, is a really healthy sheath that when it's connecting remaining neurons, here's the amazing thing it does. The speed of the action potential, which is ions flowing in and out, it's kind of like the movement of a charge. It is the movement of a charge. It's like electricity, sort of. It's an electrical movement down the long length of the neuron called an axon. It goes 100 times faster, which is pretty fast, isn't it? But that's not all. After a neuron has its action potential, it has to rest. The resting is 30 times faster. So who's good at math? What's 30 times 100? 3,000. So myelinated neurons are 3,000 times not only faster, but in a complex brain like this, they're more coordinated. The timing of firing is everything in the brain. So when you're myelinated, you are 3,000 times more coordinated and balanced. You are more integrated, which is why an adolescent's brain is so much more efficient than a kid's brain. I know I'm shocking you. Everyone's going, no way. But yes way. Okay, because this is happening. Now, here's the key thing about remodeling as we get to the limbic area. It is influenced by one's own internal state. And this is why, another reason I wrote the book, was because there is absolutely nothing, zero, available for an adolescent to read about their own brain, and nothing to give them exercises to strengthen the integrative capacity of the brain, which is what the Brainstorm book does. So then you say, okay, well, what is this pruning and myelination, this integration of the brain? Really, what is it about? Well, the first thing to say is it doesn't end when you turn 20. It goes into the mid-20s, sometimes even to the late 20s. So the remodeling period, we're saying, is what's defining adolescence. And adolescence is not just, teenage years. That's another myth. And the other thing to say is that adolescence, at least in the US, where it's been studied, isn't just a couple of years as it was 150 years ago. It's actually going on for at least a dozen years, if not more. Okay, so the limbic area. Let's talk about what's changing in it. Now, to understand these changes, I'm going to tell you a quick story, but I'm noticing the time, so I'm going to talk to my teachers. Where's my leaders? May I take a few extra minutes? Did they leave? Where are the organizers of the event? Because I'm asking for it. Is it okay? All right, so I want you to close your eyes, and I want to tell you just a little story, and I want you just to let yourself soak in whatever this feels like for you, because to understand the limbic and cortical changes we're about to go through, you really need to understand why nature is remodeling this brain. So picture this. You're really, really comfortable in your bed. Let's say you're 4 years old, and you've slept really deeply, had some beautiful dreams, and the rays of sunlight are beginning to come through the blinds, the closed blinds of your window. And your mom comes in your room, who loves you like crazy, and she kisses you on the forehead and says, "Good morning, sweetie." And you begin to rouse, and you say, "Good morning, Mom." And she goes, "What would you like for breakfast?" And you go, "I think I'll have some oatmeal." So she calls down to your other parent, your other mother, your father, whoever it is, and let's say it's your father, and your father says, "Okay, I'll make the oatmeal." And then you smell the oatmeal cooking, you get out of bed, you go to the bathroom, you brush your teeth, you get your pajamas off, you put on your preschool clothes, and you go into the kitchen. You eat this delicious oatmeal with some walnuts and some raisins and have some orange juice and some extra time before you go off to preschool, so you watch some cartoons, and then you go off to school and you play with your friends, you learn how to share some toys, but Billy doesn't share, so you tell the teacher, and you work it out by learning to name your feelings, and then you take a little rest at school and get up and have a nap, you play some more, and then it's time to go home, so you get picked up and you come home and you watch some more cartoons, and then you have some lunch, and then you take a little nap because you're tired. You go outside and play a little bit, and then you come in and you dance around to some music, and it's time for dinner. So your dad says, what would you like for dinner? And you say it, and they make you dinner, and you getting a little tired, so you watch another set of cartoons, and then you go up to your room and you brush your teeth, and they put you in the bathtub and scrub you down, and then you dry off, get your pajamas on. They get you in bed, give you a massage, sing you a song, and read you a story, and you fall off to sleep. Now, if nature didn't do something really big time to your brain, why would you ever leave that oatmeal house? Why would you leave? You'd have to be, well, out of your mind, right? In fact, I know a lot of spouses who are trying to get that oatmeal situation back. You know what I'm talking about. So if we just start with these limbic changes we're about to go through, we need to understand that nature is pretty clever. And nature doesn't do something just out of willy-nilly. To get this kid out of the oatmeal house, you got to do something. It's not just true with people on the west side of Los Angeles. It's true across all human cultures, and it's also true even in other mammals. So this is just where we're at, right? So watch these changes in the restructuring through the remodeling process of this limbic area. So a 14-year-old is not just a 7-year-old with 7 more years of experience. We need to understand that. And the hormones ain't raging, the brains are remodeling. That's what's happening. And it's happening with a purpose and a power to it that you're going to see right now. So the limbic area, one of the things it does is it works very closely with the body proper and the brainstem to create emotion. So yes, studies of the adolescent brain show that emotion, body input, brainstem input, and limbic input up into the decision-making cortex is much more robust. Let's call it what it is. It's an emotional spark. Now, what's the downside to this emotional spark? You can be moody. You can be unpredictable about your feelings. As one adolescent, when he heard I was writing this book, he said, you make sure you tell those readers, especially the adults who might read that book, that sometimes we're going to feel one way, and about half a minute later we're going to feel another way, and that's just the way it is. Give us some space. But if you're a parent who jumps all over your kid because they're emotional and you don't understand, they're emotional because that's the way their brain is, what's going to happen? Stop, don't talk to me about that, young lady. Then what's she going to do? She's going to get more reactive. And then you've started a fight that is completely unnecessary. If you allow emotion about 90 seconds to arise and fall, it goes on its way. If you try to get rid of it or intensify it, it's going to really dig itself in. And that's as much relational as it is what an adolescent can do with their own mind. So that's the first thing, is you're getting, what's the reason for this emotionality? We think it's just literally to evoke motion to get you out of the oatmeal house. That's one way to think about it. The second thing the limbic area does, besides emotion, that it works with the brainstem of the body, is it works closely with the brainstem to motivate us. And the motivation of a 14-year-old is totally different from the motivation of a 7-year-old. And when I talk to middle school teachers about this, they go, well, why didn't someone tell us that? Because these kids are totally unmotivated, those lazy, apathetic, selfish 14-year-olds in my class. That's how they talk when they're not around parents. So we have a bunch of schools that are thinking about becoming Brainstorm schools to take these ideas and actually restructure, 6th grade through 12th grade. We have a whole province in Canada that's thinking of doing it. Because as you'll see, there's a profound empowerment that happens when you think about these brain remodeling issues. So that's number 2, motivation changes. You're motivated differently. Number 3, the limbic area is very important for what's called appraisal. Appraisal has many layers to it, but the first is what's happening right now important enough for me to pay attention to? You can see that changes. Number 2, if I'm paying attention to it, is it good or bad? Number 3, if it's good or bad, how do I elaborate that? And there's all sorts of layers about that you can read about. But the bottom line is appraisal changes in a big way during adolescence. It's not raging hormones, it's remodeling of this limbic area. Number 4 is memory. Now what's interesting about memory is kids develop a form of explicit memory called autobiographical memory in a much deeper kind of way. In fact, if we were to do a study of all of us in this room, and I know some of us are adolescents in the room, I can see, but for the ones who are not adolescents anymore, you're over 24, I can tell you whether you're 24, 34, 44, 54, 64, 74, if I gave you a bunch of neutral words, one of the main sources of autobiographical memories that will come to you will be experiences related to your adolescent period. It's an amazing set of memory research studies. So that's just interesting. Memory changes, it's in the limbic area too, the hippocampus. And number 5, really important, and there's a whole section of the book on this, attachment. Attachment is how we turn toward our parents when we're young to be protected from danger, so we're safe, soothed from distress, so safe, soothed, seen, so someone sees the mind behind our behavior, so that we feel secure. Those are the 4 S's of attachment. Safe, soothed, seen, and secure. And what does an adolescent do with their limbic area for attachment when they become 14 instead of 7? Who do they turn to when they're distressed? Their peers, as they should. And what do we feel as parents? Terrible. We're rejected. Poor us. Nah, nah, nah. So parents need to understand that this is a natural part. Now, what's the purpose of this change in social engagement? To individuate, and why is that important? So they get out of the oatmeal house. It's the same story. It's going to be boring soon. To get out of the oatmeal house. Now, what happens if you're, let's say, an antelope, and you're an adolescent antelope, and you go out into the world, and you don't have a bunch of other adolescent antelopes to be with you? What are you? You are lunch. So it is a long, millions and millions and millions of year old history to belong to an adolescent group, because there's safety in numbers. Now, what's the downside of that, of social engagement? Let's just call it that. Peer pressure, exactly. You can give up morality because membership feels like a matter of life and death. So when your kid comes to you and says, Mom, I want to buy these shoes. Well, not these shoes, but shoes that would be appropriate, not these. You need to understand, not that you have to buy the shoe, but the feeling of life and deathness is from millions of years of evolution, right? So at least you can honor the feeling behind the intensity of it. So you can give up morality for membership in a group. But what's the upside of social engagement? Belonging. In fact, every study of well-being, mental and medical, longevity and happiness is all about our social connections. It's why, sadly, as we know here in California in Isla Vista, when kids feel alienated, we have a responsibility. I'm sorry. Someone, will you give her a hug, please? Thank you. We have a responsibility for each other. And I know we can't avoid all disasters, but we can take care of each other. And if people are really so isolated, we need to do whatever we can, because relationships are as important to the mind as the brain is. And when people feel isolated, all sorts of things can happen. And that's a matter of us taking care of each other and realizing that some people get very alienated. Okay, so social engagement, incredibly important. So we have emotional spark, ES. We have social engagement, SE. Now, you're probably noticing that this is beginning to spell something. And those of you who know me from other talks know I have a problem, which is I'm an acronym addict. So what's the acronym coming up? Let's see if you can guess it. ESSE. Essence. So what's the N going to be? Okay, this is good. All right, well, let me tell you about it before we say what the N is, and you try to guess what the N is. So there is a system, we're moving up now to the cortex. Let's talk about the cortex briefly. The cortex is the outer bark of the brain, so put your hand models together, fold it over like that. The cortex is also remodeling, and as Dr. Luchter said, the most integrative area is the prefrontal region, and it is going to really do its thing, integrating everything together. It's not so much that it's super special, it's just that it's a window into the integration of the whole brain. So that's kind of the joke, that the only people who knew that before were the rental car companies, because they wouldn't rent a car to someone less than 25, right? So you say they knew without scanners, right? So, but it isn't just about the prefrontal cortex. It's the remodeling overall. So that's what we need to honor that. We don't want to just say to adolescents, oh, your prefrontal cortex isn't working. You want to say, yeah, you're remodeling. Part of the discovery of life that adolescents go through into their early to mid-20s is to find out what's life about. It's a beautiful thing. Anyway, watch this. There is the cortical processing, which is ultimately, there's 6 layers thick of neurons, about as thick as 6 layers of business cards piled on top of each other. It's folded. And this cortex basically has back parts that are making maps of all sorts of things, like what you feel with your fingers if you're blind, or what you see with your eyes if you have eyes that work. The side is for sound, the upper part is for where the body is. And the front part from this, your second last knuckles forward, this is your frontal lobe, which really makes us especially primates. We have a big frontal lobe. But the front of the frontal lobe is called the prefrontal cortex. It's basically from your last knuckles forward, just behind your forehead. It's extremely integrative. It connects the cortex, the limbic area, the brainstem, the body, and the social world. 5 independent sources of energy and information flow: cortex, limbic area, brainstem, body, and the social signals or neural signals from other people's bodies. 5 areas of energy information flow. It coordinates and balances, and that's why it's so important. That's why we always make jokes about the prefrontal cortex with our prefrontal cortex, right? Which is pretty cool that it can have that kind of sense of humor about itself. Okay, so here's the story on what we're about to talk about the N, right? There is a system that's vertically distributed that is the linchpin to understanding risk behavior in adolescence. And it goes from the brainstem to the limbic area to the cortex. So it's vertically distributed. And it's called the reward circuit of the brain. And it's mediated by a chemical. Neurotransmitter is what allows the neurons to communicate with each other. So there's serotonin, there's acetylcholine, there's all sorts of ones, there's hundreds of them. This one is called dopamine. So what we discovered in the last 15 years in humans is that there are major dopamine changes in the reward circuit of the brain when puberty hits. It's not raging hormones, it's remodeling, and part of the remodeling is a change in the vertically distributed, so it's a vertical integrative process, reward circuit of the brain that's mediated by dopamine. It's hard to explain exactly in this brief time what's happening with the receptor changes and the release levels, so let's just say it like this. Essentially, what the various studies put together show is baseline levels of dopamine are lower and release levels are higher. So think about what that would make you feel. Think about what it would make you feel. Studies show that if your dopamine levels are too low, you feel kind of out of it. Utsy, even depressed. Depression can be associated with low dopamine levels. But besides depression, because most adolescents don't get clinically depressed, that's for sure, they don't. But they do feel utsy. Now, why would nature make the baseline levels lower and the release level higher? Because the number one thing that releases dopamine is novelty. If you're going to get away from the oatmeal house, which is familiar, comfortable, certain, what do you need to do? You have to change your dopamine reward circuit so you drive yourself away from certainty, away from familiarity, and away from safety. And this is where risk behavior comes from, that you're driven to try, and that's the N, novelty. You're driven for novelty. Now, in addition to the dopamine change of the reward circuit, there's another change that's called hyper-rational thinking, and I didn't make up the term, it's a scientific term, people get so upset. Adolescents are anything but hyper-rational. Here's what it is. It's they rationalize dangerous behavior. That's why the scientists named it hyper-rational. So here's the logic. If I'm that kid in the car that I'm going to go 95 miles an hour, it's not impulsivity. I'm 19. And I go like this. I say, you know something? Brand new car, it cranks up to 150. I could probably get it to 100. My friends are watching, so I'm going to look really cool. And chances are very high, maybe 75%, that I'll be okay. 25% chance I'll crash. But here's my hyper-rational thinking. it's most likely that everything will be fine. You see the logic of that? Sort of. But that's what it is. Here's the things that are going to shock you. Adolescents do not feel that they're impervious to being harmed. When you study adults and adolescents, they have the same degree of belief that they could be harmed. So that's another myth busted. Number two, they overestimate the chance of a danger happening. They don't underestimate it. So it's not about informing them. They just don't care. So that's the novelty part. Now the CE of essence is, because I have to stop in just 3 minutes, creative exploration. The adolescent brain, the cortex, is programmed to push against the status quo that adults have set up. And so it's pushing against that also allowed that 19-year-old to say, I know the sign says 35 mph. I don't care. It's an adult that made that sign. Or my mommy told me not to drive that fast. I don't care. She's an adult in my life. So part of it is pushing it to status quo. What's the purpose of that? Get out of the oatmeal house. You want to push against that. That's for the individual. For our human family, let me tell you something. And this is as novelty too. The reason for novelty, get away from the oatmeal house. The downside is risk and stuff. The upside is life can be very exciting when you're willing to try on the unfamiliar. That's just the way it is with novelty. Creative exploration, the reason is to push against for the individual to get out of the oatmeal house. For our human family, please picture this. We adults have gone through the remodeling period. We've integrated our brains. We've found our niche. At the end of the day, after we've done our work, and if we're lucky enough to have a family, we come home to our family and we are tired. But the world is forever changing. If nature left it up just to adults to adapt to an ever-changing world, we would be sunk as a species. I want to suggest to you the reason that human beings are as adaptive, for good or for bad, to living everywhere on this planet is because of the adolescent courage and creativity to think outside the box. Major innovations in science, technology, art, and music come from adolescent minds primarily. And yet in schools, what do we do to this essence? What do we do to the emotional spark that adolescents have? We crush it as best we can. We try to suffocate it. We call it a pathology, that passion for life. What do we do to their social engagement? We tell them to beat each other out to get in the most competitive high school they can, to get the best GPA and get the best SAT score so they can get to the most competitive college, so they can get into the most competitive graveyard. Right? Everything but social engagement to support their collaboration with each other. Novelty, we have them do the same old since they were in kindergarten. And creative explorations, we do very little. Just look at their studies. They are some of the most uncreative things. Adolescents in America, for the most part, are miserable. They're not performing better in the schools. They're not feeling like someone's tuning into them. They are disenchanted. So what I say is, for the adolescent side, let's create a world in schools and even at home where we can support the essence of adolescence, emotional spark, social engagement, novelty, creative exploration. And now let me ask you a question. I'm going to close with this. Think about your life as an adult. And I want to just give you a little hint. If you took all the studies of adult neuroplasticity and looked at them, which you can do, but I'll summarize it for you, and you had to pick 4 of the top factors to keep your brain healthy and strong and growing well as an adult, let's name them. Keep passion in your life with an emotional spark. You, an adult. Keep social engagement with networks of support. You, an adult. Do new things. Don't do the same thing over and over again because you're tired. Try new things, novelty, and challenge your mind with creative exploration. If you had to pick the top 4 things to take away from this lecture for you, not just your adolescent, it would be maintain the essence of adolescence. Don't just pass through adolescence and say, oh, I'm glad I'm through that. Go get it back. And so adolescents can actually realize they can be supported for their essence, and you can actually be supported too, because you can get it back if it's gone away. And the final thing I'll just say is a plea to all of you. If you take the intellectual place we started with defining the mind as both embodied and relational, and I end the book for the reader, the adolescent or the adult reading it, And I make a plea, I say, look, if the mind is truly embodied and relational, and the self is a product of the mind, then we have an internal self called an I, and that's really what we can call the me part of our identity. But we equally have a form of our identity that's a part of a we. And it isn't just about getting rid of me and going only to we. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about developing a me in a deep way, developing an internal compass through the, I call it mind sight exercises that the adolescent has in the book, developing an internal compass so you don't drive 95 miles an hour. Why? Because your own gut and your own heart are telling you, not your mommy, not the policeman, not the sign on the door, not the sign on the street. It's your gut and your heart, literally, the neural processes around that area. You've trained them to inform your prefrontal cortex. So even though you think it'd be cool to drive that fast for your friends, you feel in your heart, you feel in your gut, beyond hyper-rational thinking in this novelty business, your gut and heart tell you, don't do it. And you've decided not to drive that because of you, and you haven't caved into peer pressure or the dopamine circuits or anything. So this is where developing a me is really important. But I say to the reader, I say, it's equally important we have a we, because this planet needs us to have a relationship with it. We're treating Earth like a trash can. So it's not just me, it's not just we. What would it be? We. M-W-E. And that way you get both worlds, and that's an integrated identity. So thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dan, for a terrific talk. I know there are going to be a lot of people that want to ask questions, and I do have some cards here. We do have volunteers circulating with blank cards. If you do want to ask a question, please write it down, hold up your card, we'll get it, and we'll do our best to work it in here. I want to start the Q&A, Dan, kind of where you were ending. So let's talk about the kid who wants to move out of the oatmeal house, or is going to move out of the oatmeal house, and wants to go to UCLA, where we had this year 100,000 applications, where the mean entering grade point average was something like 4.3, where, I don't know about you, there's no way I could have gotten into college under these circumstances.
No.
And so what we do frequently for adolescents, I tend to think of this more as a West Los Angeles disease, but it's not entirely.
No, it's everywhere.
We make kids competitive. We enroll them in all sorts of extracurricular activities. They're taking all the AP classes. They're going to high-powered independent schools frequently. And not uncommonly, the sentiment is expressed, are we robbing our kids of their adolescence?
Yes.
How do you encourage parents and families to balance out the demands of a competitive, success-oriented society with having a normal childhood and adolescence?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Professor Luchter, Andy.
Dr. Andy to you.
Yes, Dr. Andy. Yes. I certainly can tell you what we did with our kids, but in general, I can tell you what I, as an adolescent psychiatrist, what I always would tell my patients and their families. And this may get people upset, but it draws on and I don't know exactly where the journal was this was published, but if you look at the location that a student goes to college, not whether they go to college or not, because that does matter, but the location of which school, it has zero correlation with their academic success, their material, financial success, their mental success, their relational success, or their contribution to society. None. And we always told our kids that. We said, you can hear what your friends are saying, but you need to know that it's a lie to say that you have to go to the school that's the most competitive because some parent wants to name drop that. Because actually the research shows it makes no difference. We think you should go to college. So this is what we've said. So that, for parents who are really willing to hear that, they take a deep breath. Now, my experience, and I'm going to just wipe out any identification of anybody, because there may be people in this room who've been my patients. I'll just say this in general, that sadly, when kids go through what you're saying, especially in this town, because where I've been in practice, they are so focused on the expectations of the adults around them, not always just their parents, but sometimes their friends and their teachers and what they hear. And there is this lack of this internal compass I'm talking about is not developed at all. And when those kids who continue to be my patients go away to college, to these really super, super fancy colleges, and they come back, they're empty. They have no kind of internal guide to determine. They keep on listening to what other people tell them they should do. So then they go to graduate school or professional school or whatever. They continue with this empty shell. And then at various points they collapse because no one invited them to actually go inward in this larger world that they live in. So I think it's not just it's the pressure for sure, but it's the absence of development of this internal, let's just call it an internal compass. I think there's a neural structure that you can understand how an internal compass can be developed. And in the Brainstorm book, I have all the techniques to do that, showing how the brain would develop differently. So for example, if I were encouraging someone to do that, they would be very much in touch with something called interoception. They'd be able to perceive the interior signals of their body so that they would have this internal compass that you can actually develop. Studies here at UCLA and at Harvard have shown with certain practices, you can develop interoceptive capacities that are directly related, I know it's going to sound weird, but to empathy and wisdom. And it's the lack of training of wisdom in these competitive environments that are, I think, missing the mark. So I was asked to teach to all the superintendents of the United States of America. And you saw I took my extra time here. They gave me 12 minutes to do the talk I just gave to you. So ultimately what I said, look, we actually know what you need to do as a superintendent for a high school or middle school to develop these abilities to have an internal compass. You need to have this process of reflection, relationships, and resilience be your compass on what you're helping the kids develop. And this is how you can do it in their brains. So I said, how's it going with no child left behind? And they go, oh, no, like this. I said, well, what if you had a process, because the prefrontal cortex is where you get this internal compass. I said, what if you had a process of reflection, relationships, and resilient building skills where you have a policy of no prefrontal cortex left behind? And they were very happy about that. So you can actually build a school based on this idea. So I think it's a serious problem. If you just look at the stats on how we are as a country, we're doing really badly on almost everything. And that's not okay. I mean, if you think about it, we got all these financial resources, we got all this we have this creative know-how, and we just collapse when it comes to taking care of our youth. So I think we just are missing something that we can really do something with.
Okay. Great,
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sort of related to what you were talking about, the substrate of the brain on which learning happens and the key times in life when the brain is most plastic. Some of the questions we got had to do with timing of learning, approaches to learning, that kind of thing. The prime time to learn languages is, in very young kids, 5, 6, maybe even earlier than that in terms of the prime time to pick up accents and learn vocabulary. One question that came in was, if a kid's brain is most efficient at ages 15 to 16,
They've achieved adult efficiency. Yeah.
Why do we, I was going to say, my experience, not all that efficient then. Why do we send them off to college at ages 18 to 24? Should we send them off to college at a younger age?
No, I guess.
Go ahead.
I mean, it's so interesting because since I teach a lot in Europe, the European approach, kids live at home through college. I don't know if you know that. It's unusual to go to another city in Europe. And they think we're nuts sending our adolescents off. And they think that's why we have these problems that happen. And I got to say, from an attachment point of view, I think there's an argument to be made about that. So to go younger, I would say I don't see anything from the science that says we should send them up. So that's easy to answer, that one. And I want to add something to this too, because I didn't say it, but it's really important to say in this setting, that one of the non-myths, that is one of the truths, is that if you are going to develop a serious psychiatric disorder, like manic depressive illness or schizophrenia, obsessive compulsive disorder, excuse me, or an addiction, it's most likely to happen during adolescence. The old statement that it was because of raging hormones is wrong, but what we do believe at this moment is that's remodeling. Now, the reason to say this is studies in various institutions, for example, Kiki Chang at Stanford, is thinking about doing excuse me, mind training practices, thank you, mind training practices early in adolescence, so that as the remodeling begins, when the pruning process is happening, it's going to unveil vulnerable circuits that for an 8-year-old may be enough, but at 14 may not be enough, and then dysregulation happens. And sadly, with more stress, the stress itself with cortisol levels, cortisol is a stress hormone that's released when you're stressed. Cortisol is neurotoxic. So cortisol, when it's in high levels for sustained periods of time, can increase pruning. The bottom line is, if we can do early interventions, having the home life be as non-stressful as possible, but also teaching a practice like mindfulness. We have Dr. Jane doing work with individuals who are taking care of their individuals with Alzheimer's disease. And the idea of doing a mindfulness practice for the caretaker is absolutely brilliant. And the idea there is that when we're faced with a chronic stress, like taking care of something like that, or if you're an adolescent where your brain is not regulated anymore, you're in a chronic stress state too. So why not teach, for example, mindfulness practices to adolescents, every adolescent, in school as a matter of course, just like we teach people to brush their teeth. We don't say, well, let's just wait and see if your teeth fall out, and then you start brushing them. Why not teach everyone to strengthen their brain by integrating it with mindfulness practices? It doesn't make any sense. So when I say reflection, we actually have clear-cut exercises to provide in schools that will strengthen the brain, and we're not doing it. It makes no sense. And so now with neuroplasticity, I would say in terms of this, no, don't send the kids off sooner. Keep them at home. Have everybody doing these mindfulness practices. Have everyone realize there's plenty of time to be away from your parents, but we need to support parents in letting the kids start to move out.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Some of the other questions, Dan, had to do with other things that we might be teaching in the school and when to teach them. Languages we talked about. Should we be teaching kids to be polyglots from an early age? Musical instruments, should we be teaching kids how to play instruments more, expose them more to music or the arts at earlier ages? Thoughts on how that should fit into the curriculum?
Great questions, Dr. Andy. Such great questions. So let me try to address them one by one. There are two layers here. One is that, and adolescents hearing this about their own brains, they get a little freaked out because they go, oh my God, it's actually up to me how my brain is going to prune itself. I said, in part it is, in fact. And so that's both nerve-wracking for them and empowering, both. So it's a big issue to be given this information. But I'm telling you, the emails I'm getting from the adolescents themselves who read the book, it's so moving to see them realize that this is basically a guide to healthy neuroplastic change of their brain that they can be in charge of. So it's like a win-win thing. Now, in terms of what a school can do in terms of exposure to that, this is the tough thing. When you're in school, you're supposed to be good at everything, right? You're supposed to do this, do that, get your 4.3, all this kind of stuff. When in fact, when you're an adult, you do certain things, you don't do other things. So, I know Ken Robinson, who's a friend of mine, he talks about this a lot, about finding your passion, your element, Ken calls it. And I don't think it has to be one element, and I don't think Ken thinks that either, but the idea that you're going to start specializing in adolescence. So, like for example, my son, he was deeply into music, and he didn't like to play sports. So no one needed to say to him, hey, you know, haven't liked sports your first 12 years of life, but now we're going to get you to do it. And he tried, and he just doesn't care about it. I mean, he's kind of like me. He's very non-competitive. He laughs when things happen on the field. So it wasn't so good for him, especially when I was his coach. We both were like laughing, and everyone's going like, don't you care? Well, not really. Anyway, so for him, that's not going to be his passion. But, you know, music was. Now, I tell a story in the book where, you know, if you take the essence for them, when he was 14, he had a little jazz band as part of the school, and they were given time at lunch to play these instruments. So these adolescents, you know, mostly boys, one girl, but they piled up all the amplifiers, they plugged in all the instruments they could in the room to see what degree of sound they could generate from this kind of contraption they designed. What they forgot was the headmaster of the school was in the room above, and his windows shook so much they almost broke. So, you know, their response was to take their rehearsal room away. So, of course, the boys started acting out, and it turned into this vicious negative cycle. When I brought them in, I said, look, you know, the essence of their adolescence is to push the boundaries. That's what you want them to do. And they weren't trying to break anyone's window. They were just trying to experiment with a wall of sound. You know, so why don't rethink it? And luckily, the dean of students was there, and her brother had a similar thing happen to him when he was around that age. And they crashed down on his, you know, negative behavior, and he took a negative dive the whole rest of his life. They decided, in their wisdom, to try giving them back the rehearsal room, and said, look, we don't want you making sound like that anymore. They go, fine. They go, but we respect your love of music. We really do, so do that. And many of those kids are still musicians. And it was a beautiful outcome, but they had to think about the mind beneath the behavior, not just responding to a behavioral violation. And that's what we're really asking to do.
Right. You know, thinking about sort of negative behavior and how to process that, some of the questions had to do with responses to social stress, responses to bullying, how you can work with your kids in what is really a very vulnerable period of life and development to help them be resilient.
Yeah, it's a great question. These are such great questions. Thank you. So if we draw on everything we've been talking about tonight, and did it make sense, by the way? I want to just check with you. Because we covered a lot of ground. I don't know if you realize that. And you get to take your hand model home. So the way I would respond to the question is with everything we've said. I would say, look, the thing we need to do is empower adolescents to realize that who you are is not just who lives in this body. You are responsible, we are responsible for each other. We are, right? And so in terms of bullying, you need to realize that the act of intentionally trying to hurt someone else is a moral violation. And morality isn't just something you learn in school. Morality would be something that is really defining who you are, right? And so this becomes a fundamental thing in terms of stopping bullying and if it's coming from yourself. Well, that's one thing. The other thing in terms of resilience is we actually know a lot about the neurobiology of resilience. We actually do. We know it has a lot to do with affect regulation. We know that you can actually train affect regulation. It's not just you have it or you don't. You can actually develop it. So what I say is, why wouldn't a school be starting with the basics? So like we were just in Rotterdam. I was asked to fly there to kind of host this event called Educating the Heart. And the Dalai Lama was there, and everyone was there to kind of talk about this way you could actually have education be to develop resilience. Educating the heart meaning, you know, how do you actually let people be in touch with their bodily experience so that they're very grounded? And that's kind of the basis of resilience. It's emotional and social intelligence. It's the capacity to regulate your emotions, literally, to understand them in other people. And, you know, these tools, I mean, what Dan Goleman wrote in this foreword to my book, Mindsight, was that the mechanism beneath social and emotional intelligence is this mindsight ability to have insight into yourself, empathy for another person, and to promote integration. Those are the three elements of mindsight: insight, empathy, and integration. They are completely teachable skills. So that's the basis of resilience. We actually know about it. And again, you know, what would be so exciting is if the educational system and our parenting system heard these things and got empowered to actually do something to help kids develop resilience.
Right. You know, it's interesting, a number of the questions here, and there, as you can see, are piles of them.
Oh my, we're going to be here till tomorrow morning, I think.
We're just going to go for a few more.
Yeah.
A number are about adolescence and working with our kids, but a fair number are from adults who want to know about themselves.
Yeah.
And questions like, how can we repair and reprune our brain? How late in life can you remodel the brain? How long is the brain plastic? Are there gender differences in plasticity between not just boys and girls, men and women?
Yes, wow. Wow, these
thoughts?
are such wonderful questions. So the first thing, gender issues. You know, in terms of adolescence and gender issues, the timing of the pruning and the myelination are a little bit off, but interestingly, by the end of the remodeling period, they come to the same place. So, you know, just like girls begin puberty earlier and boys begin puberty later, that's true across cultures. It's the same true with this remodeling thing. It's off that way. In terms of neuroplasticity, as far as I know from studies of the brain in adults, I don't think there's a gender difference. Do you know, Andy?
No.
Yeah, so I don't think there are. In terms of the timing of that, there's a beautiful book that a colleague of mine, Norman Doidge, wrote called The Brain That Changes Itself. That's a really lovely discussion of neuroplasticity in adulthood. And the thing just to keep in mind is that it's kind of a paradigm shift for neuroscientists. And Norman talks about a lot of the issues that came up with people who clinically were saying things like the brain keeps on changing across the lifespan. But if you've read my book, Mindsight, you know I talk about a 92-year-old named Stuart. And Stuart, who's way over 92 now, he did work, when I basically said to him, he was an attorney, and I said to him, look, you know, here's what I think is going on with you. The details don't matter for this question, and I said, your brain can continue to grow and change if you focus your attention in new ways. And I will teach you how to do that. And he did. And it changed so much. His wife of 65 years literally called me up. She said, did you give Stuart a brain transplant? Because you can activate dormant circuits. You know, this is the thing about it. And it's so exciting a time to know that we used to think it's all fixed or you're done with adolescence, your brain doesn't grow. It's not true. You can grow your brain throughout your lifespan. Now, if you have an illness, of course, that's challenging that's a whole different thing. If you get a medical illness and dementia and all sorts of things make it a challenge to neuroplasticity. But in general, you can continue to grow your brain well across the lifespan with the essence. And so what a lot of people say, how do I get it back? And I say, do the Mindsight exercises in the book. And I can tell you, even personally, myself, having written the book, I did read it also, that I've been having more fun doing this book, even though this was the hardest book. I've written a few books. This was the hardest one to write. To write a book for both adults and adolescents to read. I don't know if you know that. There is no book like that. And now I know why. It was so hard because I wrote it. I sent it out to adolescents and adults to read. I got the feedback. The adults said, oh, that's kind of interesting. The adolescents were pissed off. They said, this is disgusting, blah, blah, blah. So I changed it, sent it out again, got the feedback, changed it again. And, it was so hard to find the tone and the voice, but luckily this one worked out.
Great. Terrific. We could go on a long time, but in the interest of actually getting you out to the foyer to sign books and meet with people, we're going to start wrapping things up. First, thank you so much for doing this
Dr.
tonight,
Andy.
Dan.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure to have you for one of these things, especially after dragging you in from spending the day with your son, who just got back from traveling around the world. Many thanks to all of you for coming out for this Open Mind and the whole year of Open Mind lectures. We have a number of fascinating lectures and a film coming up in the fall that we hope you'll be there for. I can't promise they're all going to be as great as Dr. Siegel has been tonight, but I think you'll find them fascinating, and we hope to see you in the fall. We're taking the summer off, but that doesn't mean that we'll be out of touch with you. We'll be sending out newsletters and reminders about events. And We value your continued involvement and your continued support of the Friends. It makes programs like this possible. So please also pick up an envelope in the foyer and continue to support the Friends. If you're not a member, please join us. If you are a member, please give us your continued support. Thank you. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful summer.